Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Technological changes have economic impact. It's not just that technology allows more goods and services to be produced more efficiently and at greater scale. It's also that these changes disrupt previous assumptions about the conduct of human lives, human relationships, and the methods to save money to buy goods and services. For example, a society in which people expect to die around the age of 100 or even older needs to make different plans than a society in which people expect to die in their 70s. Some politicians, in unguarded moments, have occasionally expressed a desire for retired people to, quote, hurry up and die, on account of the ballooning costs of pension payments and healthcare costs for the elderly. These politicians worry about the negative consequences of longer lives. In their viewpoint, longer lives would be bad for the economy. But not everyone thinks that way. Indeed, a distinguished professor of economics from the London Business School, Andrew J. Scott, has studied a variety of different future scenarios about the economic consequences of longer lives. He is our guest today. In addition to his role at the London Business School, Andrew is a research fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research and a consulting scholar at Stanford University's Centre on Longevity. His research has been widely published in leading journals in economics and health. His book, The 100-Year Life, has been published in 15 languages, is an Amazon bestseller, and was runner-up in both the F.T. McKinsey and Japanese Business Book of the Year awards. Andrew has been an advisor on policy to a range of governments. He is currently on the advisory board of the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, the Cabinet Office Science and Technology Honours Committee, co-founder of the Longevity Forum, a member of the National Academy of Medicine's International Commission on Health Longevity, and the WEF Council on Healthy Aging and Longevity. Despite being so busy, he has kindly given some time to London Futurists today. Andrew, welcome.
Morning, David and Callum. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Andrew, what led you to write your book, The 100-Year Life?
A number of things, actually. One was just personal, which, given the theme of the 100-year life, I think it's worth saying, which is I was getting a bit bored of what I was doing. Most of my previous work in economics had been focused on monetary and fiscal policy, interest rates. And to be blunt, there's only so many times you can talk about whether interest rates go up or go down. So I was just hungry for something different. And then there were some more personal things. My mother had just passed, and I lost my father 10 years earlier, and they both died from age-related diseases. And then I was talking to my children, who were, my middle one, in the early 20s. And he was making very different lifestyle decisions. In fact, he said to me, Dad, I'm not going to get a job when he was graduating from university. I'm going to spend a few years not working. And I guess I was quite annoyed, really. I'm not normally annoyed by my children. And it took me a while to work out why, and then I realised he was just making very different choices than I was at that age, but I couldn't really blame him for those choices. So it just got me thinking. My parents acted differently, my children are behaving differently. I was 50 and didn't really feel 50. And I just thought, there's something up here about ageing. And then, as part of a course I teach at London Business School called The World Economy, Problems and Prospects, I would give a lecture on the ageing society, and you're probably very familiar with it. Your introduction mentioned it. The ageing society is this sort of standard demographic narrative that there's fewer children, more people living longer. And so the older cohorts are larger than younger cohorts. Society is ageing, and it's seen as being basically a bad thing. Old people are a problem by this narrative. They don't work, they need a pension, they get ill, they're a burden. And then there was a chart halfway through the presentation that just said, on average we're living longer, and on average we're healthier for longer. You think, hold on a minute, that doesn't sound too bad. How have we turned that into a bad news story? So it was that then got me to realise that as well as changes in the age structure of the population, what was also happening was changes in how we age, and that was a really important thing to do, because if you've got these longer lives, you've got more time ahead of you at every age. And that means you have to behave differently and invest more in that future. And that sort of slightly more positive perspective is kind of what was behind the 100-Year Life.
Can you share some of the recommendations of the book without giving too many of its secrets away?
Oh, happy to give away all the secrets, that's absolutely fine. So the 100-Year Life, which I co-wrote with my colleague Linda Grattan, as I say, it says that the key thing is you've got more time. And for me, and certainly a theme in the 100-Year Life and one I've worked on more and more, is for me there's two features of this increase in life expectancy. The first is the recognition that at every age, whether you're 20, 40, 60 or even 80, you've got more time ahead of you than past generations. Which means, of course, you've got to invest more in your future. When I say invest, I mean it in an economic way, not just about your finances, but it's about investing in your future health, your future skills, your future relationships. And then the second key feature for me about longevity is malleability. You can affect how you age. And of course, if you're more likely to become old, it's all the more important to invest in that age malleability. So what the 100-Year Life says is, well, hold on a minute. We set up in the 20th century a three-stage life. We created a world of education, career, and then retirement. I always ask people when I talk, what two stages of life did we invent in the 20th century? And it takes people a while, but then they realise that we invented teenagers and we invented pensioners, which of course are key parts of that three-stage life. And what we're doing now in response to longer lives is just trying to change the parameters of that three-stage life. We're trying to raise the retirement age. We're trying to increase how much we put into our pension, lower how much pension we get. But if you are going to live to 100, and we can come back to whether that's true or not later, then really just stretching out that three-stage life looks pretty bad, because you end up starting work at 20 and working to your 80. So you have a 60-year career, and most people, when I tell them that, aren't terribly excited about the prospect. And of course the story is we have to structure life differently. Because if you do just have a 60-year career, there's not much that you can learn at 20 that will still be relevant when you're in your 70s. If you carry on working in the way we currently do, you're probably pretty exhausted and bored by the time you hit 70. So we say you're going to have to break up that three-stage life and move towards a multi-stage life. One where your career may be broken up with different shifts. Sometimes you may be working just for money, working very hard and full-time. Other times you might need to take time to raise a family, to look after elderly parents, but you'll be perhaps looking for a different work-life balance, as they say. It also may be that as you get older, you want to work part-time. You might want to take career breaks. You want to do transitions and learn new skills. So basically, we change the pattern of life. And I guess the simple punchline of the book is that in the 20th century, as life's got longer, we took more leisure after retirement. But as life gets longer, we will work till we're older, but we'll take more leisure this side of retirement in the form of sometimes part-time, sometimes breaks, etc. So that was the thesis of the 100-Year Life, a new career structure and a new working pattern. And it certainly seems to have struck a chord. I think the book sold nearly 1 million copies now. It's been interesting seeing the response from firms and individuals who seem to be tapping into some of the ideas.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
I must express some envy at the figure of 1 million copies of the book that was sold. You clearly have struck a nerve with that.
Yeah.
But I understand you've done more research into different models subsequently. I see in reference to a paper in which there are various names of economic models or scientific models of aging which are taken from Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
So what has your research done post that book?
100 Year Life was written as a non-academic book. It was a surprise success. But I'm an academic researcher, so I thought, you know what, this is the topic I'm interested in. And I was travelling around, meeting all sorts of different people, geroscience, the health, finance. But I thought, how do I get societies to start acting on this? And I realised I had to go back to central banks and ministries of finance, because they have some pretty powerful levers to pull in terms of how society and the economy adjust. So my academic research now is very much around the economics of longevity in various dimensions. And the particular paper you're referring to is one I published in Nature Aging with David Sinclair from Harvard and Martin Ellison from Oxford. And what I did was say, okay, let's use economic tools. So economics is great, and you may not like it, but it's great at putting a dollar value on things. And says, how much is these things worth? If you think about aging better, of course, no one's going to say, I don't want to age better. The question is, how important is it? There's lots of demands on our time, lots of demands on governments for resources, and how much should be allocated to healthy aging. So there's economic tools we use. The health service in the UK, the National Health Service, has an economic tool that says a drug is worth it if it saves this many years of life at this cost. So we use some of those tools to start thinking about different ways we could age better. To do so, we came up with 4 different characters. One is the Gulliver's Travels one, which is the Struldbergs, who live on the island of Luggnagg. Struldbergs is broadly, I would say, the path that we're currently embarked on. So if you think about aging, there's sort of 2 ways to think about aging. One is my probability of dying, my mortality risk, and the other is my health at any particular age. So there's a survival rate and there's a health function. And what the Struldbergs is a way of living longer just by lowering mortality rates. But it doesn't change how you age. Your health is whatever it used to be, so health still declines with age. In Gulliver's Travels, the Struldbergs live forever, but they age normally, and they just dread aging, because eventually they're going to end up in a very physically frail and incapable state. So that's the Struldberg one. So we say, well, let's imagine you carry on increasing life expectancy in that way, and you get more time, but in diminishing health.
It seems that many people assume that is the default. Whenever I talk to people about the possibility of longer lives, they tend to assume, well, it'll mean greater years of decrepitude and worse decrepitude. So I'm glad to hear there are other models which need to be highlighted.
Well, totally. And of course, that theme about sort of saying if you've got more time ahead of you and ageing is malleable, then you need to do something about it is the heart of the work. So it is remarkable, isn't it, how people think that how we age is fixed. Overcoming that is a major problem. There's also another problem, which is that we underestimate our capacity in later life. We underestimate the capacity of older people. So we kind of exaggerate how bad it is, where of course much of the evidence suggests that actually how we age is very diverse. There's clear socioeconomic determinants of how we age, and older people tend to be happier than people in middle age. So it's quite remarkable how negative we are. So in trying to look at other options, we also look at a Dorian Gray one. Dorian Gray is one where we don't increase life expectancy, but you keep people healthier for longer. So you raise the health profile at every age. And then we looked at 2 other ones. One was a Peter Pan one, which said, what if you could slow down aging? You would affect both health and mortality, so we'd live for longer and we'd be in better health. And then we looked at a character we called Wolverine, who was reversing aging, so you could reverse your biological age. And then we just applied these economic tools to say, well, if you live longer or you live healthier, what is the value? I guess there's a number of punchlines. The first is that even the Struldberg one, it's valuable. We value life. Life is sweet. And even if you live in longer in poor health, there is a value to it. But it diminishes. It diminishes more rapidly the worse your health is. The Dorian Gray one is enormous. Even though you're not living for longer, you're living in better health. And basically we find that based on current US data, it's more important to compress morbidity to get health span to match life expectancy than it is to push life expectancy out anymore. So it's all about healthy aging. But of course the Peter Pan one, where you're both living longer and you're in better health for longer, is even better. So we put some numbers on this, and there's lots of other intricacies. The paper's trying to say that actually focusing on single diseases is nowhere near as valuable as focusing on aging better. But the real value is just how big the numbers are. I mean, we really find that if you can slow down aging such you live for another year and your health is better, for the US it's worth $56 trillion. For most countries it's about 4% of GDP. So the punchline is just really simple. Few things matter more than our health. We saw that from COVID. We're quite prepared to trash the economy to save lives. And actually, given what's happening in the West in terms of survival rates and disease, the most important health challenge is to age well. So therefore, the punchline is that we're talking about multi-trillion-dollar values to us as a society from aging better. It's remarkably simple. Health is important. The biggest health challenge now is age-related diseases. The value to us of aging well is huge. For my next book, I had the following simple logic. The data says you are very likely to become old. You fear getting old. What are you going to do now to make sure you age well? That's really just, for me, the longevity agenda.
Andrew, in your book, you talk about 100 years.
Yeah.
But I noticed that you're working with people like Peter Diamandis and David Sinclair and Jim Mellon, who envisage people living much longer than that. Are you now doing your modeling and thinking about people living much longer lives than 100 years, even getting to longevity, escape velocity, and living for thousands of years? Are you looking into the social and economic consequences of that?
In a model, you can do whatever. So in an economic model, I certainly have done. Personally, I don't know. First of all, I sort of hope we don't hit longevity escape velocity soon, because my goodness, our social practices need to change to deal with where we are now, let alone if we get longevity escape velocity. Our cultural view of aging, our economic institutions. I sometimes think it's probably going to be sooner for the geroscientists to succeed than the social scientists to get governments to respond appropriately. So I'm sort of nervous of anything happening radically too soon. My own position tends to be short-term pessimism and long-term optimism. But the way I see it is as follows. The ways we succeed in living a 100-year life, they're the same ways we'll succeed as living a 120-year life in terms of social science. And they're the same ways we'll succeed in living a 500-year life. So actually, the social recipe for success, a multi-stage life and continuing investing, I think will roll over from 100 to 200 to 300. From that point of view, I don't think there's any different source. But the logic, I think, about my long-run point of view is I think we are, and this is my next book I'm working on called Evergreen, we're at a unique moment for human history. I know every business school professor always says that, but it really is true. We've had the first longevity revolution, which was getting the majority of people to now expect to live into their 70s and 80s and beyond. Average global life expectancy is 73. It's an extraordinary statistic. So now we're about to have the second longevity revolution, because as the results of that Nature Aging paper show, the most important thing now is to age well, which is to change how we age. And the logic of that Nature Aging paper is very clear, which is when you're ill in your 80s, you don't really want to get into your 80s. But if you can get into your 80s and you're well, then you want to live into your 90s. But if you're ill in your 90s, you don't want to go beyond that. But because now the most pressing health challenge is to age well, every time we age better, it's going to increase the demand for further longevity. And that's a really different stage, because if you think about the past medical breakthroughs, when infant mortality was a major problem rich countries faced, is what we targeted. But once we succeeded with infant mortality, we'd focus on midlife disease. And once we focused on midlife diseases, we're now focusing on age-related diseases. But I say, the better we get at age-related diseases, we're not going to give up on them. We're just going to keep pushing more and more on, I want to age better. Because if that marginal year of life is in better health, I want it. So that's that sort of virtuous circle around aging research. To be honest, where does that end? Well, it's going to be some battle between the limits of human biology and human ingenuity. And I couldn't comment on which one will win out. But that's where we are in terms of a virtuous circle. So yes, logically it could end up with 120, 200, 500, because this is just the beginning. If we get people healthy to 90s, we're going to be pushing for 100, etc.
You said you're more pessimistic about politicians being prepared to change key aspects of society than you are regarding biogerontologists and other scientists making scientific breakthroughs. And I can see that politicians are often conservative and lagging behind the possibilities, regardless of which party they're in. But surely, if you have a figure of $56 trillion, surely that's going to make politicians pay attention. Surely they're going to say, actually, this deserves us being open-minded.
Yeah, it's happening. It's like with any big cultural change, I don't think it happens quickly. It's sort of water dripping on a stone, because we have so many deep-seated prejudices about ageing. Like your comment, David, that there's nothing we can do about how we age, or that we underestimate the capacity of older people so that they're a burden and nothing good can come from them. At one level, I sort of understand that, because for most of human history, not many of us have become old. So we haven't invested in those later years, because it's always been a 10% minority chance of getting to your 80s. But when it's a 60-70% chance of getting to your 80s, we need to invest into those later years. But that's a massive cultural shift. And what I find is, even when I tell people about 100 Life and they get it, they understand it, they then walk away and start thinking in old-fashioned terms about ageism. So it's a massive cultural shift we've got to change. And there are many reasons I'm fascinated by what the geroscientists are doing. But one of them is it just powerfully says to governments, you know what, age is malleable. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's a sort of double take about the claims of geroscience, because it does sound fantastical science fiction to many people. But once you sort of see, oh, it's really about making age malleable, then you start looking around and go, well, of course, age is already malleable. There's 100 things we can do to age better. The gap in healthy life expectancy between the rich and the poor. We know that we have some friends who look good for their age. That concept of age malleability, once you get people thinking of that, I think it's hard for them to think about anything else. And certainly with 100-year life, I do find some politicians, finally think, oh, actually, there's a good news story in this. And actually, wow, that's a powerful one. And I think that's really, really key, because I think the demographers with their ageing society narrative have really done us a disservice. Because I think that notion of the changing age structure of society, yeah, of course it's there, but it's really not for me the most interesting or powerful part of the story, which is these changes in how we age. If only we can get people to understand that. And I don't think governments are doing that very well, because look at the current problems in France around state pension age. And I'm very sympathetic, actually, to the protests about raising state pension age in France. But, all governments are doing is just raising the retirement age. And if that's all they do, they're really not equipping us for a longer life, because that does nothing to make people more employable for longer. It does nothing about people's health for longer. It does nothing about their skills for longer. As a university professor, I'm very lucky. I can carry on working for a long time, doing something that I enjoy. But if the only thing governments do is just say, too many old people, you've got to work for longer, but do nothing to keep us healthy in our 50s and beyond, to keep us productive from our 50s and beyond, we're not supporting people. So I think for me that's the key. But once you get that more positive story, at least in my experience, I find people go, oh, actually, yeah, that's a more positive story. It motivates me. And actually, this is good. I'll come back to the ageing society story. It's remarkable how negative we are about it. What's really happened in the 20th century was we had fewer infants dying in early life, fewer parents snatched away in midlife, more grandparents and great-grandparents meeting their grandchildren. And all we can do as economists is turn around and go, shit, that's a bad news story. I mean, it really is quite remarkable.
It is remarkable. I spend a lot of the year in a village in Spain where there's a lot of people around my age, sort of mid-60s and quite a bit older, some of them. Most of them are in great health because they live in this fantastically healthy village. They have great diet, great outdoor lifestyle. But mostly they say, oh, I don't really want to get too far into marriages. That's enough. That's long enough for good life, which I think is a bizarre point of view. So there are these very entrenched prejudices and old cultural views about age. But what we've seen recently with COVID, and it's not the first time, wars do this as well. When there's a crisis, old, deep ingrained cultural ideas can change in days, actually. Before COVID, I don't think anybody was seriously thinking that most people could work from home. And the idea of a 4-day working week was ridiculous. And now it's here because this drama made us take it seriously. And the same, I haven't lived through a world war, but the same must have happened at the beginning of the 2 world wars. Everybody's views about how their lives were going to pan out changed totally. So let's imagine that Aubrey de Grey, I'm sure you know Aubrey, let's imagine he's right. And then in the next couple of years, he demonstrates robust mouse rejuvenation, i.e. he demonstrates that it's possible to give a middle-aged mouse an extra year of life. And he says that's cast iron proof, well, maybe not cast iron proof, but very solid evidence that longevity escape velocity in humans is possible within a decade or two. And lots of other scientists who sort of think that might be true now, but certainly aren't going to come out in public and say it. They all come out and say it. Then you might get one of those tipping point moments in public culture where the great majority of people suddenly realize, wow, it's possible that my dad, my mum, my grandma need not die, or at least not for many, many, many years. And that would be great. Now, you could get the culture turning on a sixpence, which I think would be great, and hopefully it happens. But of course, we're not ready for it because there'd be all sorts of practical things that would have to be done by politicians and planners. And what you're doing with your modeling could come in incredibly handy because you're creating some of the tools that those people will need if that does happen.
Thank you, and I hope so. One of the great things about economics is it's about incentives and resources. I'm amazed economists haven't spent more time looking at longevity, because what have you got? You've got more resources, you've got more time. And with more time, it changes your incentives, you behave differently. And what is truly remarkable is that most governments and economists take as given that improvements in health and education are good for the economy. But they always think it's about young people. But really, if you're improving health and you're improving education, whether you're in your 20s, whether in your 50s, or whether in your 80s, it'll be good for the economy. And that, to me, is just the simple punchline of longevity. So there's no doubt about it. What we have to try and do is achieve a three-dimensional longevity dividend, is what I call it. We do already have long lives, let alone what may happen if there's longevity escape velocity. But what we've got to do is make sure that health catches up with life expectancy and our productive capacity catches up with it. And by productive capacity, I don't just mean working, I mean just being engaged in life. Some of that is about what science can try and achieve. But even given our life expectancy right now, there's a lot we can do to improve our health and do our productive skills for longer. And if we achieve a three-dimensional longevity dividend, it's good for the economy. It just seems trivially obvious to me. If you're healthy and you're productive for longer, it's good for the economy.
Are politicians and economists anywhere in the world more open to this than other places?
So things are beginning to shift, and it's sort of interesting going back to Callum's point about social change. Let me give you a few answers. In the general sort of who's doing something about things at the frontier, the answer is normally Singapore. So yeah, Singapore's doing some stuff around this. And actually the UAE is also looking to do some things. That's a mixture of geroscience, but also looking at social planning, employment laws. But there's something really interesting happening at the moment for me, which is sort of twofold. The last year in some ways has been quite encouraging. One of the things I think is really important right now for governments around the world is to get people working more from 50 onwards. There's all this sort of big push about increasing the state pension age, and I understand why. But if people aren't working by the time they reach the state pension age, they're not going to work after the state pension age. And loads of people stop working from age 50. People withdraw from the labour market from 50 years onwards. And it's very rarely I can afford to retire decision. It's driven by bad health, they have to care for someone in bad health, it's their skills mean they lose their job, or just ageism in the workplace. So there's a really big fall in employment from 50 to 65, for which often people are completely unprepared for. So making sure people work from 50 to retirement age, to me, is absolutely the most important priority for governments, and it generates an economic boom and benefits for individuals and governments. And then after COVID, of course, what's happened is, particularly in the US and the UK, people are going, well, where are all these older workers gone? They're withdrawn from the labour market. So the labour market decisions of older workers is now actually affecting economic growth and inflation. And suddenly ministries of finance and central banks are going, oh wow, how do we keep these people in work? I think that's a massively positive benefit for longevity, because it starts to shift the perception of older people as actually someone who you want to be productive rather than you think, oh, I'll just ignore. The second thing that is really interesting is the recent UK and US life expectancy trends, which I've always said it annoys me that when they decline, there's really not much policy reaction, whereas when GDP declines, we have the central bank lowering interest rates, ministers of finance pumping the demand. But there really does seem to be quite a high-profile reaction to how bad the life expectancy numbers are in those countries. So we're beginning to see life expectancy as an important variable. And I think that's a really good change. I mean, I would like healthy life expectancy to be a national target for governments. But I do think that's a very important shift in the national dialogue. How do we keep older people working longer? And life expectancy is actually a key indicator of the overall success of government policies.
You mentioned your forthcoming new book, Evergreen. Is there anything else you can tell us about that? Is it the same as we've been talking about now, or are there other aspects to it?
It'll be the best book I've ever written. It comes out next March, so I've still got another round of changes to do. So what I'm trying to do is bring together a set of principles about how our economic system, our cultural system, our health system, our financial system, and how we as individuals need to think differently because we already live these very long lives, and then tries to explain that logic that, in a way, this is probably just the beginning. But the most important challenge is to act, to age well, to be evergreen, and we need to create an evergreen society. So it's really trying to say move away from the aging society story with this obsession with more old people, and saying actually the really important thing is not changes in the age structure of the population, but to seek changes in how we age. So it's trying to pull together from a range of different disciplines, economics, finance, my attempt at explaining neuroscience, but also bringing in psychology, philosophy, health systems. But I'm excited about the book. It's coming out next March. I think I've enjoyed writing it. As you know, David, it's no fun writing books.
Maybe as a final question, I can ask for a friend. If there's somebody in their mid-60s or so and wants to have a healthier life going forwards, what's the best kind of advice that you would distill from your research?
There are people far better qualified who will tell you about supplements or sleeping more, etc. I just think it's about how we frame it. So I'm 57. I hear things like 57's the new 40. I think that's just wrong. I just think 57's the new 57. And what makes it different is that as a 57-year-old, I have more time ahead of me than any 57-year-old in Britain before. The average Brit, for instance, has never been so old but never had so long left to live. So you've got to make a friend of your future self. You've got to give your future self more. And it's very hard at 57 to know what I'm going to want when I'm 87. So I have to give myself options. If I think about what those options will depend upon, it'll depend upon health, relationships. It's going to depend upon finances. So nothing rocket science. It's just literally you've got more time ahead of you than the previous generations. You've got to give your future self more consideration and make a friend of them. And make sure you have the options to have the life that you would want to have at that time.
Andrew, thanks very much for sharing that advice. I will definitely be underscoring some of that in my own notes. People who are at my age have never been so healthy and never had so much life ahead of them, and we need to plan on it. Well, I look forward to seeing your book. I hope it is available soon. You mentioned March next year. I look forward to that. And I encourage all listeners to this podcast, if you liked what you heard, please take the time to give us a 5-star rating so that more people will be encouraged to explore these ideas, and hopefully more people will discover that they can have a better, healthier life ahead of them. Not just medically better, but financially better, psychologically better, socially better as well. Thank you, Andrew.
My pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you, Gavin.